Hello, I'm David Beckmann. This is the first in a series of webcasts on poverty, communities of faith, and the politics of 2021. They're based on a course that I've been teaching in Berkeley, jointly sponsored by the Goldman School of Public Policy and the Church Divinity School of the Pacific. They're about 30 minutes apiece. They're enough to last once a week between now and the 4th of July. I envision people watching them on Sundays, starting today and going to Independence Day, sort of from faith to politics, from the Easter season to the 4th of July. Because of the experience of recent decades, we know that we can reduce poverty. We can dramatically reduce poverty in this country and also around the world. We're coming out of the pandemic, and it is possible to accelerate, to get back on track toward the end of virtual end of material misery. There are debates about what are the best strategies. Those are important debates. But I think the more critical problem is organizing the political will to do what we know could work or what we think could work. What's missing is the organized give a damn. So I think that also points to problems in the values and spiritualities of our country. How is it that we can tolerate much more widespread hunger among children in our own communities and in our interdependent world? How can we tolerate near starvation in many countries around the world when it really isn't necessary? So what this webcast series is about is moving from basic ethics that are shared by almost all the faith traditions in some way, to political will, to the progress against poverty that's possible. I'm really encouraged that in 2021, in fact, one of the main topics of debate, of public discussion, is poverty and social injustice. President Biden, his first legislation, the American Rescue Act, is doing more for poor and near poor people than any legislation since the Great Depression. And the White House is now working on Build Back Better legislation. The idea of that is to invest in, make public investments in things that will make our economy more just and sustainable. Most importantly, make it possible for more families to be able to earn a living. I'm disappointed that so far the Republicans in Congress are voting as a bloc against everything Biden. What I'd like to see is that the two parties would work together, with the minority party offering to vote for the bill in the end if they get their way on some issues. I think you get better legislation that way, but that's not what's happening. Instead, it's voting as a bloc to make this president unsuccessful. And they're doing that, I think, even some Republicans who I think could see the value in what Biden's trying to do. I think they're doing it because Trumpist attitudes are still very strong among some of their most enthusiastic voters. On poverty issues that are important to vulnerable people generally, President Trump's policies were harsh. I don't think there's any getting around that. But the truth is that most white Christians voted for Donald Trump in 2016 and 2020. That's also part of the politics that we're living in 2021. I think the most important thing to know about poverty is that we can dramatically reduce it. If you think you can't, well then, you help somebody out. You give $100 to a food bank. It's important to give $100 to the food bank, but we can do more. If we work together, use our political process, we can establish systems that make it possible for people to take care of themselves. Let me start with a story that starts way back at the beginning of my professional career. My first job was in Northwest Bangladesh. My wife and I lived in a town called Takargaon, and I spent a lot of time, both days and nights, in a little settlement called Goria, about 100 families. And I stayed with the primary school teacher. His name is Mr. Badi. His wife had gone to stay with her mom and dad during the time she was getting ready to have their first baby. And so Mr. Badi was able to welcome me into his one-room house. So I slept there with him at night and spent a lot of time hanging out with Mr. Badi and his friends. I'm not sure I did too much to reduce poverty in Bangladesh during those months, but I certainly learned a lot about poverty and about people there. I got a chance to go back to Bangladesh about 10 years ago. I went back to Takargaon, I went to Goria, and amazingly, I was able to find Mr. Badi. It was a wonderful reunion. He held my hand, took me back to his home. Within 5 minutes, there were several other neighbors who came over to see me. We used to meet together after sundown. There was no electricity, so we would talk for a few hours about life. My Bengali was good enough then that I could at least participate. Just a wonderful experience. And what most struck me was how much less poor Goria is than it was when I lived there. Bangladesh generally has made dramatic progress. The roads are better, the schools are better. There are more foods in the market, fruits and vegetables. The children look healthier. Mr. Badi used to have a thatched house. He's now got a concrete house. He was really eager to show me that the gully where the mosquitoes used to breed has been filled in. The road from Goria to Takargaon is now tarmac. It used to be impassable in the rainy months and almost impassable the rest of the time, but now there's a tarmac road, so the farmers can get their jute out to market. They sell that in the world market. And they can bring more things are available to them in Goria, including police services. It was a problem then that the police didn't get out in the country very much. So there'd be an isolated house, and if a bunch of thugs would come at night with machetes and rob you, there really wasn't much you could do. Now there's good police coverage in places like Goria. The thing that most surprised me is that women are more assertive than they were when I lived there. When I was living in Bangladesh, I almost never saw a woman. They were in the house. They couldn't come out. They certainly wouldn't talk to a man, not a foreign man. But on this follow-up trip to Bangladesh, I talked with quite a few women, mostly through interpreters, but low-income women would explain what they were doing to make their lives better. And when we went to see the mayor, the head of the panchayat in Takargaon, it turned out she was a woman. So it just was wonderful to see what's happened there. And those kinds of stories can be found in thousands of villages in many developing countries. I'd like to share with you my favorite bar graph. You can see the bar graph that shows the dramatic progress that's happened in the world. Just dramatic progress. These are World Bank numbers. I think they're fairly reliable numbers on absolute poverty. Absolute poverty is about the equivalent of $2 a day. At this level of income, you don't eat enough, you don't eat what you should, you don't eat good quality food. Children die in large numbers. It is a severe kind of existence for people. And back in 1990, the World Bank estimates that there were 2 billion people in absolute poverty. By 2019, they estimate that was down to about 600 million people. Just extraordinary change. You know, I'm a preacher, so I look at those numbers and I just think this is an experience of God. This is God moving in our time. It's something like the Exodus, great liberation, but much bigger even than the Exodus. You can also see the numbers for the United States. They show that our progress has not been as rapid. The first number is from 1967. That's a long time ago. And in fact, most of the progress in the US was, in all those years, was made between 67 and the early, about 1973. So during those years, during the 60s, there was rapid economic growth into the up until 73, 74. And then both President Johnson and President Nixon set up, what they together did was to set up the social safety net programs for low-income Americans. Those programs have been in place, they've been improved over the years, and they reduced poverty and have maintained it at a lower level for all those years. We haven't made as much progress as many other countries, and that's mainly because wages have been pretty much stagnant for all those years. But it's important to note that we have made progress. It's not impossible. And it shows us that we can do more. I was served at Bread for the World for almost 30 years as president and recently retired. And it gives me a chance to think in a broader way about how to achieve the mission of Bread for the World. Bread for the World is a Christian advocacy movement to end hunger. Lots of churches, hundreds of thousands of people across the country are involved. Importantly, some people are very involved. A smaller group of people give it a lot of time and thought. And together, all those folks contact their members of Congress on issues that are important to hungry and poor people. On the global issues, going back a ways, when I started at Bread for the World, pretty much Bread for the World and some of the other church groups were almost by ourselves in advocacy for poor people around the world. A big turning point was the Jubilee debt relief campaign of around the year 2000. Jubilee is a passage in Leviticus that calls for debt relief once every 50 years. And so there was a scattering of Christian people of all stripes around the world who wanted a Jubilee for low-income developing countries. They had accumulated impossible debts, crippling debts, debts to the rich countries. So Mozambique, for example, was spending more money to pay interest. They couldn't pay down the principal just to pay interest on their debts to rich country governments than they were spending on healthcare for all their people. So the idea was a jubilee, and when we started, there was not one member of Congress, not one member of the administration who thought that was a timely idea. But we gradually picked up steam and were able to attract, importantly, really important Republican leadership at the very beginning in Congress. So that we won big. Over the years after that, the industrialized countries wrote off a total of $100 billion in the debts of the poorest countries, of many of the poorest countries in the world. The program was focused on governments that were managing their own affairs pretty well, and then the World Bank and the IMF managed it in a way that encouraged governments to use this opportunity to invest in poverty reduction. A lot of the governments of Africa used it to make primary school free for the first time, which meant that a whole generation of girls got to go to school with their brothers and learned how to read and write. We also gathered support as that movement moved. And very importantly, Bono, the Irish rock star, came to the US and helped us. He gave tremendous, and he stayed involved in the politics of poverty, especially in the US. He gave us just tremendous help. And then I think Bono helped to convince Bill Gates that investing in advocacy on global health and poverty issues made sense. And so the Gates Foundation has strengthened the capacity of advocacy groups significantly. They created a number of new groups so the constituency for international aid is much, much stronger than it was. Also, George W. Bush turned out to be a really important president on Africa poverty policy issues. And Barack Obama also expanded aid to Africa and other poor parts of the world. And through that whole process, we also managed to make the aid programs more effective. The faith groups did not do this all by ourselves at all. I think we were especially strong at the start of this acceleration. But faith groups, Bread for the World and others were part of the process all the way through, every step of the way. Really, most of the credit goes to poor people around the world, hundreds of millions of people, families that work really hard to get to make their lives better, lives of their children better. Many developing country governments really deserve a lot of credit. I think Americans have a low view of governments in developing countries, but a lot of African governments really did a good job. And but it also helped that the U.S. and the other high-income countries increased and improved their aid. And it helped to convince me that people of faith have an important role to play in the politics of poverty. Ironically, on the issues that affect hungry and poor people here in the USA, we were always, almost always on the defensive. trying to protect the social safety net programs for low-income people that have been so effective have been more effective than anything else in reducing poverty. In 2010, very conservative, the Tea Party people won big in those elections, and they managed to convince almost all Republicans in both houses of Congress to vote for deep, deep cuts in low-income programs. Every budget resolution that passed either house of Congress between 2011 and 2018 proposed to cut something like $2 trillion from programs like Medicaid and SNAP food assistance. Religious leaders of all stripes rallied around and said, I was surprised that that conservative, liberal, Catholic, Protestant, evangelical, Jewish, Muslim, African-American churches, of course, there was really near consensus among leaders of church bodies and associated agencies that it wasn't right to make deep cuts in low-income programs. Of course, there are a lot of religious people who went along with those programs, but the presiding bishops, the heads of denominations, people who oversee Sunday schools and the worship life of religious communities on a large scale, there was near consensus that we should protect those programs. We said, sure, we want fiscal discipline, but we don't think that poor people cause the deficit. And we want these programs to work well. If something's not work well, we'll help to figure out how to make it work better or shift the money into another program that will work better. But we don't want to cut the programs. And I think that united stand really helped. And then also the faith-grounded activists across the country also play a really, really important role. So these are people who understand that changing the world for God is part of their life, and they make it their business to know the issues and to get to know people in the congressional offices, get to know staffers and their own member. So they are very effective, often, usually very much welcome in congressional offices because they're thoughtful and respectful, and they are outstanding lobbyists for people in poverty. On these domestic issues, I don't want to say at all that the faith communities were the most important actors. The Democratic Party resisted these cuts. Lots of groups other than the faith community were part of the lobbying to stop those cuts. But what's wonderful is that despite years of budget controversy and several government shutdowns and all that, in the end, Congress made no substantial cuts in low-income programs. They'd approve the budget, they'd move massive legislation, get close, and then repeatedly, especially in the Senate, a handful of Republicans would vote with the Democrats, and so the actual cuts just didn't happen. And now that same coalition is working in a dramatically new context, not to just support whatever President Biden wants. There are real issues there, but but to support the direction of helping the people and communities that have suffered the most during the pandemic, and also changing our economy in ways that will make it easier for people to make a living. On those issues, we really are supportive. I'm pretty sure that most of you who are watching this webcast are yourselves leaders in this great cause. Otherwise, you wouldn't be watching. And my hope for these webcasts is that they help us to achieve the great liberation from poverty that God's made possible in our time.